Welcome all to the last session of censorship and information control during information revolutions. This will be a 2-day session focusing on policing of readers and the efforts that censoring bodies take to police not creators of content, but people who seek to access content. We have so many people that we're not putting everyone up at once because discussions here have been a little richer with fewer people than with many, so we're going to take 2 days and rearrange our combinations of people a lot. So as we look at the question of policing readers, Hannah, I'd love to plunge in with you giving us the 30-second version of your work on inquisitorial licensing and how it works to create different populations of readers with different levels of trust. And then I think this will strike many chords with others on the panel.
Great. Okay, so I call this the license to read. So in 1559, the Roman Index of Prohibited Books bans many, many authors from being read in Italy, largely because they're Protestant. And so you can't read Protestant authors in Catholic Italy. Punto. But what about the ones who aren't talking about things that are religious? Like, okay, maybe Catholics shouldn't be reading Martin Luther, but what about the ones that are writing books of pharmacopoeia, books of medical plants, books of animals, books of recipes? Physicians from all over Italy start writing to their inquisitors to say, we don't know how to medicate without Leonhard Fuchs. We need these books. These books are useful and they're important, and they aren't about religion. Well, maybe they are in certain ways, but we can change them in ways that will make them acceptable. And so this starts off a process of trying to make texts available at the same time that they're censored. And one of the things that you have to do legally in Counter-Reformation Italy in this period is to apply for a license to read those prohibited books. And this licensing system, reading licenses, lasts until Vatican II. So if you wanted to read Voltaire circa 1920, I think this is true, you'd have to apply, you'd write to your bishop, there's like forms by then, specific forms that you'd fill out asking to read the text and why, and certain types of texts are allowed to certain types of readers. And so I'm tracing that in particular, looking at medical texts. But I found lots of these. This isn't just like a couple cool physicians are reading. Got like 500 physicians in the early 17th century reading, 5,000 requests for licenses to read prohibited books. This is a huge bureaucratic project going on to ensure that people who are trustworthy are able to have access to materials at the same time that that other people are not, and that even those trustworthy readers are not allowed to read some things. And I'll stop there because that was totally 90 seconds, but I can talk about this for a long time.
Glenn, does that sound familiar or parallel?
Well, it does. My latest research is a project very much grounded in the present, which looks at the way China has created digital databases of articles like JSTOR, which many academics use all the time, to digitize historical journals for research purposes. And I discovered along the way that China is actually very carefully sculpting them, rewriting and sanitizing the historical record, making certain things disappear from the past, to create a particular version of history that accords very much with current priorities, current ideological priorities. And so the readers are actually sort of being made complicit, being co-opted, whether they want to or not, in this larger ideological project. And what is interesting about it is that by using digital technologies and using databases, they're actually able to export this outside of Chinese borders onto the entire world, so that foreign scholars who use these databases, and they're essential to the work that we do, also become co-opted in that larger project too, as readers, but also producers of knowledge. Because to the extent that we use this sanitized version of history as the source base on which we produce new knowledge, we become complicit in the agenda of the censors. And so it's very complicated work.
How does this reflect trying to sort of divide elites or elite readers or particular circles of readers and consumers of information from other populations of readers? Who has different access to stuff? Any?
Well, something to know about early modern Europe that I'm sure you all know at this point is that many of these works are circulating in Latin, so they're aimed at a Europe-wide educated audience, though these are people who are all working in a second language, right? So this is for elites. So there is, I think, very compelling thesis about censorship in Italy in the early modern period, the proibito capire thesis, the prohibition on understanding, which is that censorship also, all of these norms are divided between different realms. People who are not able to access Latin culture at all, who don't speak Latin, and then within people who can read Latin, a certain subset of people who have the connections or the expertise or get a little lucky or are rich enough to be able to get licenses and maintain libraries that have prohibited works in them.
In my case, the technology, the fundamental digital technology, allows them to essentially create new versions of the historical record that are geared towards specific audiences. And so some of you may be aware, for example, that about 1.5 years ago, Cambridge University Press was found to be censoring articles from a British journal in the Chinese market. And they did this because the Chinese exporter through which they sell products in China said, here's a list of articles we want you to make disappear. And they were able to do that only within Chinese boundaries, simply by IP addresses. And so the version of this journal available to readers and researchers in China was materially different than the version of this journal that was available outside of China. And so you have two competing editions of this journal, which raises interesting questions about which is more authoritative. Similarly, there are archives, digital archives of the People's Daily, which is the principal newspaper of the Chinese Communist Party. And there are two vendors that supply access, one of whom hosts its servers in China, one hosts its servers outside of China. You will get different results for the same search query, depending upon where the servers are. And so it serves different readers and provides very different kinds of information to them.
I was going to talk about some copyright-related stuff that kind of overlaps with this. The copyright industries have created a series of standards, none of them hugely successful so far, to define what a family is, and to then say within the family, content can be shared, and outside of the family, it can't. So a notable example would be the DVB, the Digital Video Broadcasters Forum, who do TV standards for Asia, Europe, Australia, and parts of South America, have an idea called the authorized domain, which is this constellation of devices that try computationally to decide whether they all belong to the same family unit. And I was part of the standardization for this. And one of the things that was explicitly rejected were use cases that reflected the way the majority of the people in the world actually organize their families. So we proposed, for example, that a family might consist of 2 parents in Manila and a son who's a construction worker in Qatar and a daughter who's a domestic worker in America. And they said that's not a use case we can accommodate, but we can accommodate use cases like a family that owns a minivan and a boat and a second house. And within this regime, you end up with these differential access to content, not based on the content itself, but based on the extent to which a family conforms to the view of what amounts to a star chamber of entertainment executives who meet in private to decide what a family is. There are elements of this you can see in the way that Netflix, iTunes, the other content systems police password sharing. Oh, one other thing I wanted to mention, apropos China, you may know that Google is about to re-enter the Chinese market, a censored search engine. Just before they left the Chinese market the last time, I debated publicly with the product manager of that, and he argued that it was a poor user experience to let Chinese people see search results in Google that would then be blocked, and that it was a service to the users to block to omit search results that would then be blocked. And so this is the kind of language you often see restrictions being couched in. Executives who build these content restriction systems, like the authorized domain, always carved out these professional equipment exemptions, where the kind of equipment that they had would not be subject to these restrictions. So you have this parallel where you have elites who are not subject to the same limitations as the plebs.
I like the sort of aesthetic element, though, too, which I think shows up, like, that it's a bad user experience to see things that you then can't interact with. The equivalent with early modern books, as we see in Ada's exhibit, is people actually are blacking out parts of them, but sometimes instead of doing that, booksellers will talk about how instead they're going to paste white paper over a section so that you don't damage, so the book doesn't look ugly. Or you'll see words transformed into nonsense, strings of nonsense characters so that you can't read what it says, but also it then sort of looks like a type ornament. Maybe it's not ugly in the same way that black does. I think that there is this awareness of censorship being
Aesthetic.
ugly.
Yeah.
And some of the people who are applying to write, or applying to ask for licenses to read prohibited books, they'll occasionally say, like, if I have to censor them, I don't want to have them at all. I only want them clean. There's this like very frank recognition of the ways in which this mars books for them.
And does that actually happen, that the Vatican gets back to them and says, no, we really want you to expurgate this?
No, they have to expurgate them. You never, yeah.
Okay, so...
it's a nice try. It's like a rhetorical move, but it's not
But it's not actually
Yeah. But I think it's helpful in that it makes explicit these ideas about what they want the books to be and to look like.
Well, so the price you pay is you may have the book, but you must cross out the text in the book. One of the prices you pay for being given access to privileged material that other people don't is you must also become one of the parties who then further mars and transforms and censors the material yourself.
Right.
That if you want that elite access, you also have to become yourself a censor,
Exactly.
even against your preference.
Exactly.
What I find in the materials that I've been looking at and the kind of digital censorship that's occurring of the historical record and on these article databases is actually quite different. They're trying to make the censorship as invisible as possible so that you have no idea that it's even there and you don't know that you're missing anything. And the idea that there would be indications that there's something missing, I think, is anathema to the project that they're trying to achieve. And so, for example, these digital databases will very often omit any indication that there are breaks in the page numbering simply by omitting any page numbering in the tables of contents.
Wow.
And there are no placeholders to suggest anything's missing. And so you think you're getting the complete thing. And there's no way you would know otherwise unless you had access to the original paper, which exists somewhere off-site in storage. And I think that part of the idea is that these things will be made to disappear. People will forget about them, that they ever existed.
I think that not forgetting is really, really important to the Catholic censorship context, that you're, at the same time that you're required to cross Leonhard Fuchs's name out of every copy of his book that you own, you also have to keep a piece of paper that says that you're licensed to read Leonhard Fuchs's book, and you have to reapply for it every 3 years. So you're not forgetting, you're never forgetting. And I think that it's a different, like, this is, the modern censorship paradigm for me is much more secretive, like what you're talking about. It's entangled in ideas about secrecy. And I think that the early modern is not. It's very much about changing the way that you approach texts with this idea of heterodoxy in mind constantly, that you're always at risk and that you always need to think like a censor, and that seeing a blacked out name isn't about not being able to read the name necessarily, that it's about embodying a sense of Catholic readership that causes you to read with concern and an eye for what might not be acceptable within it. So it's insidious also, I think. I think it really changes readership practices, but in a very different way.
Right.
So this is a way in which modern copyright censorship maybe diverges from historic censorship. So I talked last week about the Australian censorship regime that had been proposed. It's since been passed into law. And it updates an earlier censorship regime that was a site blocking order. So some websites will be blocked by the nation's ISPs if they were found to infringe copyright through a very one-sided process where the representatives of the website didn't get to argue on behalf of the website. They were always outside the country. So you would effectively have a rights holder who would petition an Australian court in a one-sided proceeding for a blocking order. Sometimes the ISPs would show up to defend the site, but more often it would just be purely one-sided. And the update to the law now adds a search engine blocking order. And so what that means is that, back to China, when you search for a website, you will not see the website. If it's blocked in Australia, you also won't see it in the search results. And so the argument goes that this will stop people from circumventing the blocks, but it also means that these one-sided proceedings will not be checked by the subsequent knowledge of Australians that a website is blocked. you won't even know the website exists, so you'll never discover that it's blocked, so you'll never object to the overblock. And the last time Australia's national firewall filter logs were leaked by WikiLeaks about 8 years ago, it was found that although the firewall was only supposed to contain child pornography and a few other extreme categories of content, that 95% of the stuff that was in Australia's national firewall did not rise to the standard that the Australian statute set for censorship. It had just been filled with everything that bureaucrats didn't think Australians would see. A lot of gambling sites, sites about drugs, sites about suicide, and so on.
This is a bit of an arcane question, but it was what I was going to ask before. So if the Chinese system removes completely, say, particular papers from a run of a magazine or a journal, wouldn't, even if they don't have page numbers, wouldn't there be an issue with citation, where when you try to cite something, it's going to become apparent that you mismatch with other people citing the same things from who are not in China? When I know that this is probably only going to affect like two people will ever see it.
Yeah.
Or does it mean you just can't cite by page number at all?
I think Adrian points to a very good question. Yes, I mean, there are traces that remain that these things existed, but that affects a very, very small number of people. And this was actually my entry into this question, which is that I'm a voracious consumer of footnotes, and I would encounter footnotes along the way and then try to find the original piece, and lo and behold, it was not available online, but I could find it on microfilm. And so simply the burden of having to do that is enough to deter a lot of people. And so it's not necessarily essential to make it disappear completely, but you make it difficult enough to find the original piece that most people are not going to do it. And it happens on a scale large enough that it's simply impossible to do it for everything that does disappear, that they succeed more or less.
We're all aware of sort of the situation with search engines in general in China. Would a reader or a scholar come to these databases with different expectations, as opposed to us coming to, say, somebody based in the United States coming to JSTOR expecting a certain level of inclusion?
Right, right. It's been, I mean, it's not news that China censors. Everyone is broadly aware of that. And yet, even within the scholarly community that works on China, the work that I have done by specifying exactly what is happening and analyzing how they do it has been very eye-opening. And I think there's been a certain level of naivete about how to approach these things simply because we're very busy. We have projects we want to get done. We enter our search terms into the search engines. They generate results. There's content to work with. And so we can go about our business without realizing what is missing. And so actually shining a spotlight on that, I think, has been effective, because it's one thing to know this abstractly. It's another thing to quantify it, measure it, show how it is happening. And then the question arises, well, then what do we do about it? And this is more problematic because it requires training and research practices to adapt. How do you know you're missing known unknowns when they remain unknown? And so, yeah, it's a deeper problem. And part of it is also, I think, the naive approach of our libraries in treating these resources much as they would treat JSTOR. The expectation that these things, at least superficially, look like other platforms with which we are familiar. But the values and political system in which they operate is quite different. And you have to understand that local context, and the people who make the decisions to acquire these products and to make them available to us often don't understand that context, and they need to be sensitized to it.
Well, you're reminding me of these, when we're thinking about publication, we're inundated with sort of ads that tell us if you publish your thing in a journal that's on JSTOR, you'll have plus 60% citation rate. Or if you put your article up on academia.edu, you'll have a plus 40% citation rate. If you think about it backwards, what it means is if your article isn't put in this space, it'll have a minus 60% or a minus 40% citation rate. That creating some databases which are extremely easy to access also diminishes our willingness to access other resources. Anyone who teaches in grade student papers observes which sources we see over and over and which sources we see rarely, because it's genuinely more work to access A than it is to access B. And in fact, we've all had the experience of being at a library and knowing we need a book, and oh, that book is in the depository, I can't have it until next week. I'll use the other book. The other book is here. But that how those structures of organizing information are inseparable from curating and shaping the new information that's generated by that information. Another one of these arenas where it isn't possible for there to be no information control. Any organizational system for information introduces some senses of information control. And a lot of what you've commented on, especially both in the Australian and the Chinese cases of having things be invisible from search engines, is people not thinking of the structures of information as themselves being information. That the Google search results are themselves a primary source, not just a secondary source. And that it does strongly affect what information is available for that search result to be differently structured, just as it affects it for a library catalog to be differently structured, or even an index to be differently structured. Let's imagine that you're taking a intro world history course, and you have your intro world history textbook, and it has an index, only the index doesn't index any communists or anything related to communism. You would never notice unless you went to go look that up, but it would make it 10 times harder to find the information about communism in that textbook as it is to find the information on any other topic in that same textbook. Something as simple as an index can introduce these layers of structure, but we don't think of search results, indexes, library catalogs, et cetera, as primary information generators as much as we do just aggregations of extant information.
There's a Matthew effect, as it were, about this as well. You know, you've heard of Matthew effect? This is the idea that to those who have more shall be given. So it's not just that you wouldn't go to the depository. It's that because everybody else is citing book X, you assume that book X is the important source. So that's what you were going to cite as well. So it actually ramifies and multiplies up.
This is,
sorry, go.
Oh, please.
Just to say, this happens in the sciences as well. I worked with a colleague in sociology called James Evans, who became very notorious about 5 or 6 years ago for writing a paper called The Narrowing of Science and Scholarship, which argued on the basis of a huge, like millions strong data set of scientific papers, that with the advent of sort of digital networking and cross database search abilities, what had happened with experimental sciences, especially in biomedicine, was not what you'd expect, which is that the range of reference in exploring new ideas would have got wider. It was the opposite, that the range of reference had actually got smaller, it had contracted. And the probable reason for that is that he himself is actually rather agnostic about why this is happening. He's careful to document that it's happening. But the probable reason is that there's a very close feedback system where as ideas come along and are sort of referred to certain sources or avenues of inference, that sort of adds to the credibility of that link. And so everybody else adopts that link as well. And it multiplies up very fast. So the net result is that in certain circumstances, at least, within the experimental sciences, you get there's a sense that the range of imaginative possibility has actually contracted as the range of potential reference has widened dramatically.
It has changed. I was exactly going to cite that. It has changed citation practices. It's also changed promotion and hiring practices, also within academia, as certain papers that get cited disproportionately highly because they appear in the first page of search results. The people who write them become rock stars as a result. And those who might appear on the second or third page, whose work might be extremely high quality, are in a sense forgotten as well.
Well, you're reminding me of some studies that were looking at, I think they were using music, where they were asking people, here are 100 songs, please vote on them and rank them. And in one version of it, you can just see all of the songs and you vote on it. But in another one, you also get to see how many people have already voted for that one. And in the second one, very rapidly, people stopped voting for the ones that weren't already high on the which ones had been voted on. So effectively, if your song was voted on by one of the first 4 people to vote on the thing, then it would skyrocket to the top because everyone else would be voting on those 4 songs because they already looked like the ones that were ahead. But if you didn't by chance happen to be voted on at the very beginning and didn't seem to be a front runner, then you would never be pushed into one. Whereas the voting was much broader when people didn't see what other people were already paying attention to.
This is why there is, of course, an industry devoted to making sure that whatever you want to appear on the first page of the Google search does actually appear on the first page of the Google search. Yep. And it's a huge money spinner if you can get into it and have a better algorithm than somebody else.
If you're interested in reading further on this, also there's a book that came out pretty recently called Algorithms of Oppression that also looks at how like racism and sexism are coded into basic search engine functionality. So it's worth considering as well.
Corey, I remember you talking about governments sometimes trying to sort of order people to have certain things be in the first page of search results, or something similar to that?
Yeah, that's a more and more common result. It's something that's being talked about now during the debate over the new copyright directive in Europe. And the history of it goes a little like this, that in the early days, Google would maintain that the search results that they displayed were the product of a kind of empirical mathematics. And so, you know, when Google was small and the number of people who worked there and the websites that they indexed were all in the same social network and would go to the same parties in the Bay Area, people would buttonhole Googlers and say, why is my page about cats not on the first page of search results for the word cat? And the Googlers would say, well, we've written the math that finds the best pages. If your page isn't there, it's because it's mathematically not measuring up. Go make a better website. Don't try and do any search engine optimization, just make a better website. And then the governments of the world started to take notice, and they started to say, well, if the thing that determines the page results, the ranking, is just math, then there isn't really a speech interest in our dictating to you that extremism shouldn't be on the front page, whatever that means, or blasphemy, or copyright infringement, or whatever else it is. You know, now there's a lot of antitrust enforcement over whether Google was stepping over the line when it made shopping results point at its own stores instead of rival stores when people search for products. And around the time that this started happening, Google started to seek out and fund research by eminent First Amendment scholars like Eugene Bullock to write what was obviously true, that although math determined the search ranking, the decision to write the math was editorial, right? Which math you chose was an editorial decision, because when you said, we want the search results to look like this, or we want the search results to generate these responses from our quality assurance team, then you were making an editorial decision just as surely as the editor who laid out the masthead for this week's, or table of contents for this week's issue of Newsweek may not write the articles, but you are directing the overall aesthetic choices.
In the work that I look at with respect to censorship, I think the choice of algorithm is key. I've done some empirical work trying to use algorithms to reproduce the choices that human censors are making in China, and finding that they're extremely reliable. I can reproduce the choices, build a censorship engine essentially that reproduces the choices human censors are making on a particular corpus with accuracy of about between 95 and 97%. But the algorithms that I choose produce slightly different results, and so some of them might be overbroad. And if you're a regime that's interested in making everything problematic disappear, maybe you're not interested in spreading the net. It doesn't bother you that you spread the net a little too widely as long as you catch everything. But if your other approach is that you want to make sure that you catch everything accurately without being too broad, and it's okay if a few things slip through, then you might choose a different algorithm. And so depending upon what your motivations are as a censor or an information controller, you might choose this algorithm or that algorithm, and that choice is an editorial decision and resonates very much with what Corey just said. Even the censors are approaching it with these questions.
Well, you're reminding me of when the Inquisition would ban everything printed in a city, or everything printed by a particular printer, or everything printed by someone who writes letters to and from a particular person, which is casting the net wide, right? You know, this may be a Calvinist-controlled city. It's not as if every single text that they print is going to be Calvinism. Sometimes it's going to be an alphabet reader page for beginners, but you're banning it to cast the net wide because you know there are going to be innumerable Calvinist works printed here by authors whose names you don't know because they're new, whose titles use names you don't know because you're new. So you're using geography as your pre-modern algorithm in this case to predict most of these things will probably be bad, even if I don't know their names yet.
Yeah, but those ones, something like that might well be just interest groups, right? You know, your local printer might have a market in selling ABCs, so they don't want ABCs being introduced from Geneva. So they go to the censor and say, here, we need to ban all of those ABCs from Geneva because those are Calvinist ABCs. And then they wrap up the school market.
Yeah, although there's also, I mean, examples of if not banning, then being very, very suspicious of things written in particular languages. So if you take the case of the Inquisition in New Spain or colonial Mexico, there are various examples of books, but not only books, sort of other written materials, including a wonderful case of these tea towels with English written on them. And these were seized by the Inquisition. They spent a very, very long time poring over these tea towels with English written on them because anything written in English was automatically suspicious and had to be seized. I mean that might have been, you know, the Mexican tea towel market try to corner it. But
well, there's also when you have something that sweeping. Yeah. I think I brought this up at an earlier one of these sessions. Peter Lake wrote a book about the conditions of being a Catholic reader in 16th century England, when among the Catholic, what are called the recusant community in England, it's widely believed that Queen Elizabeth I's, as it were, secret police is an anachronistic term, but the officialdom is ruthlessly effective about suppressing any books that it doesn't approve of. So any books that do go out, not just the licensed ones, but almost especially the unlicensed ones, are taken by Catholic readers to be in some sense expressions of approved sort of orthodoxy. And so there's a weird way that they seem to have adopted of reading books that on their face are pro-Catholic, and actually are pro-Catholic. I mean, it actually does seem that these are books that are imported from Catholic printing shops on the continent. But they assume that they must have gone through this ultra-efficient, all-seeing censorship apparatus. So there must be something in them that is actually pro-Elizabeth. And they seem to spend effort sort of, as it were, doing a between-the-lines passing to try and work out where exactly the anti-Catholicism is in these books that on the face of it are being produced by, like, Jesuit martyrs. So it creates a very odd sense of what it is to be a skilled reader.
No, I mean, I agree. When the Catholic Church comes up with, so the term for censoring, like selectively censoring parts of text but leaving other parts there, is called expurgation. So you expurgate a book. You can also expurgate a bookshop, though. So it's like selectively taking bad books out of the bookshop is expurgating it. But you expurgate a book, and the Catholic Church starts publishing lists of expurgations. So ways that you would need to have your text corrected in order to fit a particular form, an approved form. So some of the things that I've been looking at are both the ways in which that then makes the rest of the text licit, right? So suddenly it's just okay, even though it might not be. And so people keep finding new problems. But additionally, that the debates that go into deciding what the official expurgations are create a lot of conflict about whether this is even a possible project. There's like this incredible awareness of the fact that when we read the same book, we're going to see different things in it. And this like sort of fraught sense of the instability of meaning in these texts that censorship is trying to pin down. It's trying to create a perfect Catholic object. At the same time, the censors themselves know that this is evading them at every turn.
But you're reminding me of some of Nicholas Davidson's comments about looking at inquisitional interrogation trials and the inquisitor's awareness that once you start torturing a subject, they will break and lie and tell you anything, or hold out to the end immovably, that doing that inherently doesn't work. We don't imagine the Inquisition actively thinking about the weaknesses in its system that we criticize. The inefficacy of torture as a tool for reaching truth, the impossibility of objectively policing books and creating orthodoxy, guaranteed versions is something they're deeply worried about and trying to figure out how to accomplish this goal, despite noticing, as we have noticed, that these techniques are inherently unfeasible in a lot of ways. An awareness we don't expect to see among them.
And I think one aspect of that is that over a long period, there have been repeated efforts by, as it were, the police, there are different forms of police, to produce something like a classification of readers. So, it's not just elite versus popular or Latin versus vernacular, although that may be the first cut. After that, you go into sometimes quite fine distinctions about their geographical area, their gender, their educational status, age, right? All of these things, and they're subject to a certain. It's almost just like an academic discipline to a certain extent, without having an academic home, that to do empirical research onto communities to see how you cut up the world of readers, such that you then might say, we want to excavate a book in a certain way in order to not produce this effect on this group of readers, that kind of thing. Right. It can be quite sophisticated in a weird way.
Stuart, I remember you talking about the way people are categorized in Central America and some of the colonies there. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. So, of course, in colonial Latin America is a multi-ethnic society, a caste society with people of Spanish, indigenous, and African descent. Of course, there is a desire to sort of bolster orthodoxy among all of these populations, but these, the Spanish clerics who were in the Inquisition and in the colonial administration don't treat all of these groups equally. And of course, these groups have different, they might all have to some degree a common language in Spanish, but there's also, of course, indigenous languages and certain texts that exist only in indigenous languages. So the kind of, that there's a kind of a division and a stratification of the censorship and the inquisitorial process that happens because of that. It's not only on the basis of age and education, although some of these things overlap with the caste categories.
Well, and I remember you saying that the line between indigenous and European is not as strict as we would imagine, because sometimes people of mixed race end up choosing to identify in one or another.
Well, yes, of course. I mean, this is a society that is legally highly segregated, but in reality, where there's a lot of contact and intermarriage, and also sort of forced sexual encounters as well. So you end up with a large mixed population, some of whom are forced into one ethnic category, but others who seem to be able to kind of move between them depending on the situation, and with the use of kind of dress and behaving in certain ways, dressing like a Spaniard, speaking like a Spaniard, doing things that's associated with being a Spaniard or being indigenous, and there are instances of people crossing back and forth over these boundaries, especially when they move between different cities, say. They're able to sort of reinvent themselves and sort of change their what they call casta, their caste status. So it is. It's actually quite a relatively fluid situation, although it is. On paper, it seems kind of more less fluid, more concrete. Yeah.
And then they would fall under different jurisdictions for censorship, depending on how they're categorized.
Yes. So after, in the final quarter of the 16th century, the order goes out that indigenous people are not to be subject to the normal Inquisition. So this follows a period where indigenous people had been, and there are a number of very famous instances of indigenous people being executed, in fact, for holding on to onto certain indigenous religious practices that are condemned by the Catholic Church. The situation changes in this final quarter of the 16th century, but they're still subject to another form of control. It's just a different one. It's one specially tailored to the indigenous population.
Well into the 1990s, in Chinese bookshops, there would be a back room, in which there were internal publications, 内部 publications, and you would not have access to that room unless you were a party member of a certain rank. And inside there would be publications created for a special channel of readers. And it's not necessarily that they were top secret government publications. They were simply publications about topics that the regime did not want to be publicly discussed in this way, except among a sort of internal group of people who had an approved status that could be trusted with this information, that could be trusted to speak within a particular circle about it responsibly. And sometimes it's even extended, very often it extended to translations of literary works too, that could not be trusted in the general population.
On the amazing flip side of that, I have this incredible Inquisition trial. I'm very interested in where people hide their prohibited books. Right? It's one thing where they sell them, but then once you have them, where do you hide them? Lots of people like in the trunk under the bed, you know. But but I have this one Inquisition trial where this Venetian noble family is hiding their prohibited books with their illiterate servants because they can't get in trouble for having them because they can't read them. And then they go and use them that way. So it's sort of like the flip side of your story there. This inability to attain a certain level of intelligibility with the text, so then they're allowed to have them safely in a different context.
There are a lot of browser plugins of various descriptions that people use to record the websites that they view automatically. And people who make a real practice out of screenshotting things that might go down the memory hole later. And it's often the case that when a website goes down because of a copyright complaint or something else, that after a day or two, someone turns up with a copy of it. I'm always amazed by this. It feels to me like it would be very hard to organize all of that or what have you, but it's pretty clear that there are some people who really make a practice of it.
I was reminded, Hannah, of some of your discussions of things Jesuits can have access to and others can't. I remember asking you at one point, what's the hardest thing to get a hold of? And you were saying if it's soon after the condemnation of Galileo, you'd better be a Jesuit or a king, or you're not getting Galileo. But that if you are, you're still getting it. I wonder if you could talk a little more about thinking again of the back room in the bookshop for inner party members, as Orwell would have put it in 1984.
Yeah, Jesuits negotiate their own censorship structures early on with the church. So they're not going through most of the same apparatus as everyone else. And it's interesting because this licensing system that I've been talking about is really relevant mostly to Italy. Also sort of weirdly to Poland in a really complicated way. Spaniards aren't using a licensing system in the same way. The Portuguese aren't using licensing systems in the same way, and the French aren't using. So this is it's not a Catholic phenomenon. It varies differently in different sort of places and within realms. Even more complicated, like Naples is under Spanish rule, but it uses the Italian licensing system. Anyway, all this is to say, you have different abilities to get access to text in different places and different political regimes. But then additionally, there are certain people that you aren't going to be able to get a hold of. These are like people of damnatio memoriae, of damned memory. And those are Machiavelli, Dumoulin, and right after Galileo. He gets grouped in right away afterwards. This idea that he's like sort of politically as well as religiously dangerous, I think, is something that the church seizes on. I'm really interested also, though, in how people are reading Galileo before he's banned. So Copernicanism gets banned in 1616, right? This is the sort of classic story. Part of the reason that it gets banned is because Galileo is like on a preaching tour about how great Copernicanism is with his telescope. And so this like gets it a lot of attention, and then there's a big backlash. and Copernicus is banned and expurgated in 1616. So you're allowed to have a license to read Copernicus and to correct it. In the years that follow, I then have reading licenses for people who are asking to read Copernicus, and a number of the people who are asking to read Copernicus are also asking to read Galileo's works before Galileo is prohibited. So there people are starting to like make these connections about the sort of the subject matter that's in place as well, and anticipating.
Assuming
people ask to read Cardano before he gets banned. There's this like really fascinating sort of sense of who might be prohibited. There's also really like slippery, anybody with a German name is probably Protestant worry, where people are asking to read it, and people who are getting banned who are good Catholics, but they are German. Georg Agricola, Hadrianus Junius, they managed to get themselves off of the index, some of them later, which is interesting too.
Although we should also add that, I mean, in Spain and the Iberian world, just as in other parts of Europe, there are other means of information control, right? In term, they come in the publication process.
Yeah.
Right. There's this kind of there's a kind of a sifting process that happens beyond what we're talking about as well.
Absolutely.
So this is part of a constellation of information.
Yeah, I've been talking about post-publication censorship. So books that are already in print, that you already might have them in your house, and then you need to figure out how you can. You don't want to burn this book that you just spent the equivalent of like $1,000 on. That's not an option for you, especially if you're a physician and this is cutting-edge medical research. Like, you want to keep that book. We're going to figure out a way to make it happen. Is some of the conversation. But any book that's published in Italy is going through pre-publication censorship as well, which I think is what you're alluding to here in the Spanish realm. So censors that are looking at texts and approving them before they're printed in the first place. Although, of course, then things get printed without approval, and it's sold in the back room.
I think it's actually interesting. I know this is like a historical accident because it happens to be our fields of expertise, but we're kind of jumping between the 16th and 17th century when it's a hand press era and the ultra modern contemporary internet world.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that is weirdly sort of in a certain sense shared between those is that it's relatively unproblematic to at least have the ambition to track quite kind of completely where an impression goes. So with a hand press, an impression size is somewhere in the mid-hundreds to the low thousands, depending on what it is. So it's not sort of superhumanly large, and you can track things like fonts and stuff like that, and hope to have a sense of what Poindexter would have called total information awareness. But I think that with some media that are in the middle between these two things, that even possibility goes away. And for the state and for various institutions, that's terrifying. The medium that I know about where I think that was really true was radio. So when radio came in, I mean, it's actually got quite a long ascent, but when it comes in as a mass phenomenon, which is early 1920s, late teens, early 20s, there's a big sort of conceptual problem with it, which is that it's literally broadcast. You send a signal out, and there is no tracing it at this point. It just goes out into the ether, and you don't know who's picking it up, which creates problems of all kinds. But intellectual about what the content might be, responsive. How are people going to be taking it up? You don't know what audiences are listening to it because the very primitive sort of unpowered radio sets could be built for virtually nothing. And political economic. How do you finance the activity of radio broadcasting if you're not selling copies of something? Because you can't sell copies of it because it's just out there. There is no artificial scarcity to it at all. So with radio, you have to come up with an entire sort of new apparatus for thinking through these kinds of issues in a way that, in a sentence, you don't quite with the internet, because the internet it builds in a certain sort of trackability into it, unless you have people using VPNs and that kind of thing, which insulate the user somewhat from tracking, and you see different countries adopting radio in different ways, because they have different attempts to try to solve this set of problems. So in the UK, famously or notoriously, they create a single public institution, the BBC, which is centrally controlled. It's not the same as government like simply creating content. It's not as closely censored as that, but it's aligned with government. And so during moments of stress like the general strike, the BBC was notoriously pro-government and anti-union. But in the 1930s, it wouldn't let Churchill on the air because Churchill was seen as too extreme, that kind of thing. But it's financed by a system of licensing. But the licensing is completely, this is not at all related, word aside, to things like book licensing. The idea is that if you're a citizen and you own a receiving set, then you should go to your post office and buy a license every year. And the fee for the license funds the programming of the BBC. But there's no way of enforcing that because you can't track signals or reception or anything like that. So it's based on a sense that British people are good sports. And they simply will voluntarily.
Which is not true, obviously.
But no. This is why the initial BBC actually collapses within 6 months.
Exactly.
Because it turns out that British people are not good sports, and they won't voluntarily go off and pay huge amounts of money in what's essentially a tax without some kind of policing apparatus. But the thing that I was going to get to about readers and the like is this, that there's a huge controversy that runs through the 20s and 30s, and it has its counterpart in the US as well, between, as it were, listening as entertainment and listening as experiment. Because at that point, radio was still a kind of technical scientific thing, where if you're a citizen scientist, you can be doing experimentation that might, in principle, actually advance the field. So there are hundreds of thousands, nobody knows how many people, in the UK, France, Germany, America, who see themselves as scientists. They have no particular qualifications, but they're doing research in the electromagnetic ether. And this research involves building a radio set and listening. On the other hand, there are also hundreds of thousands of people who are building radio sets and listening, but they're listening to the BBC or the networks, the emergent networks in America and that kind of thing. And the question is, how do you tell those two apart? Because the governments have this rule that they don't want to suppress science. So you don't suppress experimental listening, but you do want to sort of police and suppress, as it were, casual listening. And there are enormous internal debates, which are archived in the holdings, between figures like engineers and the BBC, about how you might tell the difference between an experimental listener, a scientist listener, and a casual citizen listener. At one point, I actually came across a letter from a BBC engineer where he's writing up to one of the managers in the BBC, and he says, well, it depends on the spirit in which you listen. If you listen in to the Beggar's Opera, this is the example he uses, and you enjoy it, then you should pay the license fee. If you don't enjoy it, you're doing science. So you're an experimenter, and you shouldn't have to pay, because science should be free. And they never actually solve that problem, because that's the closest that they get, and that's completely hopeless. But it's there are different accounts about why this idea of experimental listening goes away. And to some extent, it becomes ham radio, of course, which then actually a generation later plays into the origins of home computing. Because that spirit actually moves over into experimentation with computing in the late 60s and 70s. But with radio, I think we see these kinds of problems about classifying receptors, deciding what the responses is, how you police them, come about in a new way that was not there at all with print, I think. And I wonder with how many other media you might, if you did a comparative exercise, see these same kinds of questions being tackled in radically different ways. So with television, cinema, theater.
Well, it seems to me, to riff on something Adrian said, that I think this is where a lot of the thinking about the internet actually got it wrong in the early days by analogizing to that model of broadcasting. Whereas I think we've discovered in a lot of different scenarios that it is less like broadcasting out into the ether than sort of channeling through particular choke points that can be engineered to control content. And so one way that China does this, for example, is it sets up a very small number of gateways at the border that can police content in and out of the country. And so broadcasting into the ether is not really the right metaphor to control that. Similarly, your ISP can filter material in and out of what reaches you and block things from ever reaching anyone. And so I think, so the internet, I think we're gradually awakening to the fact that a different metaphor applies there. And so that's fundamental to the sort of re-understanding and reimagining of its democratic potential. Yeah.
I think that there's a common error in how we think about the kind of early conceptions of the internet which was that it was somehow censorship resistant intrinsically and couldn't be censored. And it was rather that the people who were responsible for the internet felt this kind of patrician sense of duty to the internet and would take steps to help circumvent censorship. So, John Gilmore, who said the internet interprets censorship and routes around it, was talking not about the internet as a technical structure, but specifically as the people who hosted Usenet feeds over UCP links. And when he said that they interpret censorship as damage and route around them, he meant that they use the mechanism that UCP used to self-heal when censorship was, when there were downlink, when a server went down, that they could use those same mechanisms to evade censorship, and that they did. And it was particularly around the Church of Scientology trying to censor posts on Usenet that published secret documents from within the church that revealed elements of its doctrine that were historically out of the public view. These ideas that you get to a certain level in Scientology that reveal that their theology includes that a galactic tyrant chained a race of pure energy beings to volcanoes 70 million years ago, and that this is the secret origin of the human race, and so on. And this is the kind of thing that you only want to reveal to someone once they've spent an awful lot of money and time in your church, because otherwise they might view it very skeptically. And Church of Scientology was apoplectic that this was just published on the internet, where someone might read it before they had gone through the long induction phase. And the idea that the internet could become centralized was a very early issue that people who thought about internet infrastructure really worried about. And I think that if they got something wrong, was that they failed to appreciate just how thoroughly the dismantling of antitrust law had gone. That it was really, the watershed was, I guess, in the mid-90s when Microsoft wasn't adequately brought to heel for its monopolism in the operating system market, the browser market. And then people started to get an inkling and really did worry that there would be centralization, and took a lot of steps to try to avoid it, although ultimately unsuccessfully, because there was such pressure to centralize the internet, both from states and from markets.
I think antitrust law here and just the marketization of information is fundamental. In some sense, we're experiencing a new enclosure movement where people have managed to harness information that used to be distributed geographically, spatially, books on shelves in libraries and among collectors. They've now, through copyright law and through antitrust law, managed to re-centralize information in distribution chains that they can control, and using technological means and copyright law, reassert control over information in a way that they had lost with the printed page. And so this actually gives censors, but it also gives people who want to control copyright and profit from the streams of income that come from that a much stronger hand in policing information.
Several different elements here have made me start thinking about the city as a unit of measure of readers, also of producers of content. But at different moments in these many phases of different information technologies, an individual city sometimes is and sometimes isn't a very significant unit of measure for thinking about the puzzle pieces on a frame, as opposed to other units you can use to measure, such as an individual, a family group, a geographic region, a linguistic, a language sharing group, etc. When the Inquisition is banning everything from X city, or when people who want to exert monopolistic profits on publishing will ban everything from X city. But we had a discussion a couple weeks ago about news and the ownership of the news, and newspapers in the era in which the demographic of the readership of a newspaper is that city, right? It is Philadelphia. And it's in the interest of that newspaper to send its news on to other cities, because they will spread the fame of the information, they will send information back, but no buyer of a newspaper in Philadelphia is gonna buy the New York paper instead, because that's not how the circulation structures in the late 18th and early 19th centuries in America operated, so that the city as a unit was a significant factor in shaping information control efforts, monetization of information, the way people thought about and measured information. And Usenet had a somewhat comparable structure, in that it really had a very geographic networking space. I think there are still some arenas in which we see the city as a unit of readership become visible in censorship and information control, but not that often. I'm thinking in particular of a friend I know who works for a big international ISP, and they've got an emergency team whose job it is to keep the internet going in a city when there's an emergency in that city. And they have a 24-hour emergency team that will try to reroute the internet around the damage. And sometimes that damage is a tsunami. And sometimes that damage is an earthquake. And sometimes that damage is a coup in which the perpetrators of the coup are attempting to control or shut down information. But for them, every so often, suddenly, the internet is incredibly geographically in a place. And it matters physically exactly where the server is and exactly where the people are, in a way that it rarely matters when we encounter it in our daily lives or when we conceptualize the internet. And I think that's an interesting question that Adrian, your comments about radio also made me think about, that radio has a radius which might include several towns or cities or a completely city-independent random circle inscribed on a map, so that it has a geography, but that its geography isn't the traditional arrangement of city and city. I wonder whether any of the rest of you have thoughts on the city and as a unit of measure within the different stuff we're looking at. And then after that, we'll close for our coffee break for a little while.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're. I think you're right. I mean, coming from the kind of pre-modern perspective, I think you're right to the point to the city, but I think also what you were saying points to the fact that these are kind of dynamic and changing systems, and let's take the case of the Inquisition. I mean, it might start in one place and have standards set in a certain place, but it can spread, right? This also allows me to use my favorite new little phrase. I mean, nobody expects the Philippine Inquisition, right? I mean, there was a Spanish colony in the Philippines from the late 16th century. There was book censorship. There was an Inquisition. People were seized for having certain books and manuscripts, especially because there were fewer books there. So we really have to think of these as kind of dynamic and potentially kind of global systems. And I mean, maybe to go back to what we were talking about before, China is trying to set standards for particular databases that will then be used elsewhere. So I mean, we shouldn't think, well, this is just a problem for China. It's a problem for a big U.S. research university if the people working there end up using these databases as well. So I think we have to kind of think on multiple scales depending on the problem.
Mm-hmm. Scale is definitely an issue. We shouldn't approach censorship as monolithic in any sense. In the 1990s and early 2000s, there was this brief renaissance of Chinese investigative reporting on social issues and embarrassing incidents, train wrecks, scandals, things of that nature. Not done by local reporters who are unable to report on things happening in their own backyard because they were too close to the scene and subject to this jurisdiction of local authorities, but by people from outside the province or in other cities who came in and could report on the story, but could sort of escape the local control. And so there was a tremendous amount of just very good on-the-ground reporting in China about things of concern to Chinese citizens on these questions. But it was all done by people hopping jurisdictions. And then gradually, as the political situation tightened, the controls became more nationalized, and it became harder for them to do that kind of work. But there was a sort of golden moment where they could kind of arbitrage the censorship regime.
This might be a good moment to bring in Hong Kong, of course, as well, with the relatively recent cases of booksellers disappearing from Hong Kong and ending up in mainland China, which I think would not have happened before 1997, and is an innovation post-handover.
I've been thinking about how the cities of America often want the freedom to establish their own internet service providers. historically have created internet service by giving exclusive franchises to cable operators and phone networks to provide internet service. And that internet service in America is some of the slowest and most expensive and least reliable internet service in the developed world. And where cities have set up their own networks, they've been very, very successful in terms of customer satisfaction and quality of service and so on. But at the state level, where so many of the state houses are controlled by ideological free marketers from the Republican Party, there has been action after action to ban cities from setting up their own municipal networks. Under Tom Wheeler, the last chairman of the FCC, that practice was ended. But Ajit Pai, who's the current chairman, who's a former Verizon lobbyist who was appointed by President Trump, that practice has been reinvigorated and has only been overridden a couple of times by ballot referenda in both in 2016 and then through some special elections and in a bunch of cities in 2018. The connection with censorship is that people who are ideologically aligned with the project of banning municipal internet because of their suspicion of state action have often framed their objection by saying, if we let cities run our internet, they will not face the same market pressure to allow free speech that ISPs face, and instead ideological bureaucrats will block Alex Jones and other right-wing figures. And for that reason, people who are on the political right should be very suspicious of anyone who wants to break up the Comcast monopoly and replace it with extremely fast municipal fiber.
The bell that it rings with me is with pirate radio, where if you go back to what in Britain is often regarded as like the glory years of pirate radio in the 1960s, when the pirate radio operators were actually on ships out in the North Sea or the English Channel, those were AM transmitters and they're fairly large scale and they're big infrastructure. But after that, in the 80s especially, FM transmission was small enough that you could fit units into the backseat of a car or something like that. So there's a second, as it were, golden age of pirate radio broadcasting in cities like London, which is very short range, analog broadcasting with FM transmitters done for a few hours and then you move. So that the detectors are not able to zero in on you fast enough to actually track you down. And if you're interested in contemporary music, a number of the waves of contemporary music have actually been led by these sort of, I don't know what you call them, like fly-by-night pirate radio operators. It's something that old image of the pirates versus the BBC, where the pirates are the kind of happy-go-lucky people, and the BBC is the staid old three-piece suit-wearing crew that we have from the 1960s, has a different iteration in the 80s and 90s and 2000s with the ability to have these very, very short-range but ultra-portable FM transmitters. But they're not quite city. I mean, they're city-based in the sense that you would do them in London and Manchester and Birmingham and Liverpool, but they wouldn't have the range to reach the whole city.
Well, on that note, we will wrap for our coffee break and be back in 15 minutes for more and for new discussants. Welcome all to the second half of our discussion of policing readers. Adrian is going to moderate this half of the session, so I will sit back.
So I thought that a question which directly relates to everybody in this room, which is, what is it to be a good reader in a situation of information control? How do readers get formed? What is it to be a responsible reader, to be a good citizen reader? This is a question that one can actually go all the way back to Milton. Everything is in Milton. And Milton poses this extensively in Areopagitica, the question of what it is to be a good citizen reader in a situation then of essentially a revolution. We're living through a situation now, as we've heard about, where information control may not be obvious, but it is ubiquitous. And maybe it's never anything but ubiquitous. And readers have been formed by educational institutions, by families, by states, by communities for many generations now. How have those things intersected? Are you happy? I do think that the institutions that you're part of do a good job in making you responsible readers to guide the next generation. But those are big questions, and I put them out now partly to seed them in your mind in hopes that you may have things to say and ask about related to them.
Okay, I will just relate to some of the points that have been raised in the earlier session by just citing one kind of phenomenon that I observed in what was going on in colonial Korean publications. So when Japan colonized Korea, already there had been legal apparatuses that would control Korean language materials before annexation. In other words, annexation was not the beginning of the colonial censorship, but already the laws were introduced in a modern form into colonial through the puppet government.
Can you remind the less familiar audience members of the dates?
So this is happening, the annexation is 1910, and the kind of endpoint I'm talking about is the end of the World War II, 1945. Here I'm trying to kind of introduce one kind of textual sign that really kind of calls for attention. So in the beginning of the early censorship by the Japanese regime on Korean materials, you could see a lot of blanks and red ink, black inks, and a lot of so-called fuseji, there's X marks and O marks and triangular marks, a lot of them. It's a visible sign of censorship. Just around the time that is going to late 1980s, 1920s, you begin to see kind of certain change coming out of interesting kind of pattern of the word censored. So here, censored is never used, but oftentimes it refers to the act of deletion. But what I'm talking about here is pre-publication censorship, not post-publication censorship. So I think before, in an earlier session, much of the post-publication censorship and pre-publication censorship really have different kind of regimes. And I'm talking about one particular regime called pre-publication censorship, exercised by colonial regime over another kind of ethno-national group's writings. So the law kind of prescribes that there should be two systems. One, permission system and pre-publication mode of censorship. Two, post-publication censorship and just reporting. The former is applied to Japanese colonial subjects in Korea and metropolitan Japanese the publication space, and the permission system, approval system, and pre-publication censorship is applied to the colonized. So there's an ethno-national kind of discrimination system already built into the publication field. So Korean publishers would go through pre-publication system because of their national identity. So many writers would even choose like foreigners as the publishers so that they could go through different system. But once they are actually publishing, there's a pre-publication system, therefore they have to submit the manuscript and then the censors have to go through the censorship procedure. And then around 1929, May Day, like May or so, the word that noted deletion began to come out like before it was a kill. There's a Chinese word called kill, very clear kind of one that was used in early decade of the 20th century, but then it changed to deletion, sakujo. There's a deletion in the Japanese word. And then it began to come out as abridgment. And you can just see that the spontaneous kind of sad would be integrated into even the order of the printing on the surface. And then after early 1930s, you begin to see a very interesting kind of stamp on the manuscript that was written by the censor to the publisher. The stamp says, the publication permitted, but caution. One, do not mention, do not leave any kind of marks of censorship. X marks or O marks or anything. Or do not leave the deleted part empty so that the deletion can be. And the third one is do not mention anywhere that censorship is ascribed. So with this, you can see that before this particular censorship regime, writers and publishers and editors could really show that there was censorship. Therefore, the readers have to really be cautioned that there was a censorship, and they had to really use their mind. And this refers to how the readers actually trained to read in between their lines and actually create their own community. But after early 1930s, now this will be changed into complete kind of facade of nothing is happening on the texts. And this will go on all the way through the wartime. Very interesting thing about this Korean, the Japanese colonial censorship system that is coming into this invisibility line would be adopted by SCAP, the supreme commander for the Allied powers after World War II. So MacArthur regime in Japan would adopt the exactly same method, but not using that ethno-national discrimination system, the Japanese or Korean kind of thing, but rather on the content-wise kind of system. So they would really start kind of showing that this is a liberal democracy, therefore you're not really showing the signs. So this part of the thing is going on, but what I want to emphasize is that this is done through the making of the colonial subject.
Let me take up your invitation to comment on the prior session. Just really one, maybe two observations. One, difficulty of finding what you want to read is not censorship. It's an attempt to influence public opinion. It's a strategy to maximize exposure to certain views. I grew up in the 50s, 1950s, and we all wanted to know about sex. You couldn't find books. It was very difficult. We all found books. We all found what we wanted to find. More recently, I love libertarian books, right? When there were bookstores like Borders, you would walk in and there would be a huge section, right? Choice, right? The bookstore's choice. Right? They would all be Barbara Ehrenreich into various points left, right? Howard Zinn, Noam Chomsky, and the kind of books I wanted way in the back that no one was, I did not feel that was censorship. It was an attempt to influence public opinion. And you can find alternatives. I discovered laissez-faire books and their catalogs. I could find anything that I wanted. It is not censorship. Censorship is people tell you what you may and may not read. People tell you what you may or may not write. That is censorship. When people get into what you may or may not think, that is tyranny, of which censorship is a part. Secondly, people all the time form voluntary associations that accept restrictions on what they may and may not say, profess, and sometimes even read. As long as those associations are voluntary, even if they are choices antithetical to my own, that has nothing to do with censorship. That you go to a Catholic Benedictine seminary and discover that they favor Catholic doctrine, which they used to, that they favor Catholic doctrine, and that is advertised. You don't go to Brigham Young University and find yourself astonished that they favor Latter-day Saint Mormon theology. It's a voluntary association. If Swarthmore College professes in its circulated literature that we are a community that places a special emphasis upon community values, upon certain notions of civility and discussion. And you go there, you can't say, they discriminate against irascible conservatives. You just can't. It's voluntary, as is Brigham Young University. But if you go to a public university or a private university that advertises itself as a marketplace of ideas, as a place that will not discriminate on the basis of race, sex, gender, sexuality, and that says you may think the unthinkable, you may read the unthinkable here, this is a place of debate, and you discover that they have formal or informal speech codes that privilege one group and not another. We have names for that in ordinary civil society. It's fraudulent inducement. It's fraud. It's lack of truth in advertising. They sold you a Cadillac with a Chevy engine. I think I bought a few fake Chevy engines and things. So I think one needs to be clear that censorship is something quite dramatic in human history and is very different from attempts to influence public opinion, to favor certain viewpoints in public opinion, or that censorship occurs in circumstances in which people voluntarily have agreed to be part of a community that favors and that prohibits certain views.
So how would you comment on the blurry line between censorship and information control, which we've often returned to in these discussions?
At the most extreme, before I would use the word censorship, right? Mm-hmm. If you can find it without needing an IQ over 130, it's not censorship.
The thing is that so the image that comes to mind quite often with this kind of question to me is the very last shot in Raiders of the Lost Ark, where they take the Ark and they put it in a box, and then they put the box, and what you see is the box going into this vast hangar full of identical boxes. And the idea is that it's not destroyed, and it's not, I mean, who knows even if they lock the door, but nobody's ever going to find it because it's stuck in the middle of this like limitless Borgesian sort of library of boxes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's lack of information control in a sense, in that it hasn't been organized amid the rest.
Yeah, I mean, that too, it actually hadn't occurred to me, but that's true. That you could take that as an example of the suppressive effect of lack of information control. In a certain sense, that's a pure libertarian system.
Mm-hmm. Of course, one of the critical conditions is if you know that there is that information control going on, and you're in a society in which you are free to criticize it, expose it, and work formally and informally against it. Quite difficult in China, much easier for people such as I if we're up against Google.
I just wanted to interject that I don't know why we would need to pose censorship as a unitary thing as opposed to a spectrum. For me, the reason we think about censorship or concern ourselves with it is because the effect that censorship has on this marketplace of ideas. And so things that distort the marketplace of ideas, I don't know, I guess we can quibble over the threshold crosses over into censorship, but the distortionary effect is the thing that we care about. And so attending to something as distortionary or not, to me, is the significant part. You know, if you censor a thing that nobody's looking for and nobody ever looks for and nobody notices, that is not particularly important, even if it is censorship. Whereas if you just put your thumb on the scales in a way that shapes the debate generations to come, to the detriment of this idea of a free marketplace of ideas, that's much more salient, even if it doesn't rise to the level of censorship, First Amendment question.
Yeah. I think that's true. But if I look at the period I know best, the 18th century, most of the works that you would think of as the influential works of the French Enlightenment circulated. They didn't circulate with official permission. What the regime was concerned about was information control. So that took the form of raising the price through selective persecution of booksellers, almost never of authors, of booksellers and book peddlers, which is what people used to do. Literally open their coats and there would be forbidden books. The system that the control of the librairie, the book trade in France, used in the 18th century was you would give official permission to books that met every standard of this threatens no one in positions of power in the status quo, but you would seek to raise the price of books that you allowed to circulate by a system known as tacit permission, permission tacite. It's not legal, it's not written. You have verbal or friendly communication. Yes, you can publish this. You will not get a royal privilege to publish it. You will not have the approval of a censor, but we're going to raise the price of it. And you could find, not only find those ended up being the most influential works of the 18th century that changed European civilization.
I wonder if I could take us in a slightly different direction, and that is because many of us are focused on censorship in the pre-digital, pre-algorithmic age, and the paradigm, I think, is a little bit different there in the sense that censorship requires an act of human volition. It requires a certain amount of mobilization of human labor to accomplish. And because of that human limitation, it makes it very difficult, and only rarely do we see censors recursively going through censorship decisions that were made decades earlier to revisit them and re-censor things, simply because they have enough on their plates right now to do. The algorithmic models of censorship that we're seeing in today's world change that because they're infinitely scalable. It's just a question really of processing power, and human labor is not as involved and is not part of it. So instead of having a set of discrete acts of censorship where people are reading a text and making decisions about, okay, what is not acceptable at this particular moment in time, and making deletions or modifications or excisions from the text. Instead, we should be thinking of censorship as a dynamic process, a series of infinite revisitations of a corpus, because algorithms can do that now in a way that humans were never able to do in the past. And they can revisit an entire archive, millions, billions of characters, roaming them effortlessly, constantly, to infinitely reshape them from day to day, depending upon what your priorities are, in a way that was never possible before. And so we get to this new model of dynamic censorship, of effortless mutability that is qualitatively quite different than anything we've confronted in the past. And it makes the record much more sort of difficult to nail.
But you're not saying there's an act of will to censor at the beginning of that?
Oh, there is. And there are human judgments being made about how to tweak the algorithms. But the transaction costs have been lowered to such an extent that it becomes feasible to do it at a level of detail and with a frequency that was simply impossible, and at a scale that was simply impossible in the past. So you could, for example, let's say if you woke up in a bad mood and you had the power to rewrite the entire record of the New York Times today. That was simply impossible 40 years ago.
I think I also can just share some sentiments with you, because the reason why I actually began to study the censorship of the Japanese regime was that the resources and time and effort that went into this censoring the Korean materials by the Japanese police, whether the police were Korean or Japanese, humongous in terms of budget of the colonial government. In other words, I think that there was a definitely clear volition on the part of one nation over one ethnic group to the other to control the mind in a certain way, because there's a certain kind of resistance already anticipated and expected. Therefore, there's a very drastic kind of moment with which they were really imposing this system. And the meticulous translation projects were just amazing. So all the Korean materials into Japanese translations, sometimes verbatim, sometimes synoptically, enormous kind of corpus was kind of produced. That's not just like just to delete the mind, but they wanted to learn about these people, what they were actually thinking. So the censorship as a kind of control is actually about learning process as well. So in this process, I think a lot of materials are produced, but interestingly, the Korean case was just lasted for 30 years or 40 years. Then at the end of the World War II, these materials are really burned a lot. So it's very hard to even know where to start and where to kind of end. And this not just applies to colonial case, but even in Japanese case, the emperor system that was really denounced by the Allies after the war, really kind of attributed to the one ministry called the Home Ministry, which really controlled the whole thought in the Japanese empire. And the ministry itself was disbanded. And as a result, a lot of materials also.
Lucas, sorry, go ahead.
I'd like to come back to another theme from the first session with which I strongly agreed, namely that to look at the official written policy of censorship or rights of publication, rights of distribution in a society tells you very little. You absolutely have to know how people behave, what's the system in place. So, for example, it was commonplace in early modern French history, European history, but early modern French history for the longest time, to say that the triumph of the Orthodox at the court of Louis XIV succeeded in suppressing innovation in thought, challenges to existing authority, until his death in 1715. Now you get the Regency, now you get the explosion, now you get the Enlightenment. In fact, in the 17th century and in the late 17th century, with the strictest attempts at control by the devout party at the French court, authors circulated the most heterodox ideas. One, you could write commentaries on authors and share all of these thoughts in a final, all of their thoughts in a final chapter. You say, of course, this person's wrong. Of course, I bow to the authority of the church. Astonishingly, those books are easily published. You could play, and it's a wonderful game in the 17th century, the search for the right approbation or censor. And there's a lot of horse trading that goes on before a book is published as to who will be the reader, the censor, and who will give the theological approbation if it's a matter of theology, but also without trying to. If you're in a culture that has ideas in ferment, the most orthodox theologians in 17th century France have to follow a certain model of the disputatio in order to make an argument which includes coming up with the strongest possible objections to your own arguments. To the contrary, said contra. And there is the most widespread circulation of the most atheistic, critical, irreligious ideas devised by learned Orthodox theologians who get criticized to create straw men against their own arguments.
Right, so they're writing a debate with an imaginary mock atheist, right? So they're making up the positions of this imaginary mock atheist.
Or they're taking it from Epicurus, or they're taking it from Lucretius, or from Hobbes. Yep.
I was struck by the line about algorithms, because when you said that, my first thought was, well, it was to ask almost like a Robert K. Merton type of question, and ask, well, what's the ethical framework within which coders are trained, such that if they're given, it's like the old question that used to be asked about scientists in the weapons industry, right? Scientists are supposed to be trained with the humanistic values of the sciences, you know, a certain communitarianism, a certain objectivity. This goes back to ideals advanced by Robert K. Merton in the 1940s. But notoriously, plenty of scientists have been willing to go off and work in the weapons industry and don't seem to suffer any kind of internal psychological torture from doing this. So I was going to ask about whether there was a counterpart problem for people who do the coding of algorithms for say, changing the record of the New York Times.
Can I expand on that question as well, and then pass it back to you to continue asking it? Because I had a parallel version of the same question. We have all these cases, as Alan was just talking about, with you're going to publish a radical book, you fish around for the right censor that you know will lubricate it through the censorship process. We have other cases that Hannah has found, or that I have found, or that Stuart has found, of radical books getting saved by the very inquisitors whose job it was to destroy them, and then disseminated clandestinely or later or in another context by the human agents who were the decision-making parties in this. One of the things that an algorithm doesn't have is a college-educated human being sitting there reading the radical text and making the decision about it. And I was discussing this at one point online, and someone posted, but there will always be a radical young programmer willing to sabotage the system. And my instinct is that feels like it asks a lot more emotional courage to sabotage, to knowingly and conscientiously sabotage an algorithm than to lubricate through a book by a friend. But I don't know, and I would love to hear both Glenn and Corey expanding on Adrian's question, comment on that.
I think the thing is, though, that there is another issue, another layer in which something like algorithmic interventions are different from, say, priestly ones, which is that algorithms are subject to transposition. They're often invented for something like biotech, and then you just lift them wholesale and apply them to a different database.
But that happens to priests. You're invented to persecute the Jews in Spain. Now you're persecuting the Protestants in Spain. This is absolutely copy-pasting the priest onto the new problem.
So you cut and paste priests across. But there's a sense in which, for the title of this course, we've problematized over and over and over again censorship and the control part of information control. This is one of those areas where you want to problematize information, because before maybe when, I don't know, mid-20th century, there isn't quite that sense that you can take automated codes and shift them wholesale across radically different, what would have been taken to be radically different bodies of knowledge. But now you can, I think, and that changes the status of the Mertenian question.
There is a portability to them, and so to an extent they are dual-use technologies. I mean, some of the same fundamental technologies that are powering the search of YouTube for copyright infringement, or the policing of our social media platforms for odious content and computational propaganda, the sort of stuff that is very much on the front page of the New York Times today with regard to Facebook and the way it has been used to sort of polarize and manipulate attention. Those technologies are easily, I mean, every advance that's made in that space instantly accrues to the kinds of censorship that I study in China, because the underlying technologies are portable and highly compatible. And so if we achieve an advance in one area that might be more socially appropriate, that we might be comfortable with in particular contexts, we have to be, I think, cognizant of the fact that this technology is portable for uses that are more problematic by our standards. Now, with respect to the ethical question, I think that presupposes that you're in a context in which you have the freedom to make the choice. And in some places, one doesn't have the freedom to make that choice. One is told simply, these are the rules, you must apply them, and there are consequences if you don't. It's interesting, the materials that I have studied very closely. I don't believe that we are yet at the stage where automated censorship bots are making the choices. I think that is coming very soon. What I reckon is happening is that our peers, very well-educated specialists, in my case historians, who know this material very well at a real high level of technical methodological training, know this material well and also are aware of its pertinence to contemporary controversies, which after all is the reason why one would censor it, are making the choices. They are making the selections. So potentially, my counterparts, my peers, my colleagues in China are being asked to, here's a body of sources, you're trained in this, you know it well, and there are advantages to you playing ball, or there might be consequences if you choose not to participate, but get to it and do the work. What comes next is that this is actually, you can do machine learning to kind of learn the decision rules by which these human beings are making those choices, and then apply them more broadly in an automated sense.
I wanted to talk about the relationship of the labor supply to these questions. So I'm not an expert on the clerisy during the Inquisition, but my impression is that there was no shortage of second or third sons to go and be priests, whereas there is a massive shortage of people who actually understand machine learning. And this has really tilted the balance of power towards techies. And we're in the midst of something of a tech worker uprising where, for example, thousands of Googlers walked out over things like sexual harassment. They forced the company to abandon a military project that was a kind of trial run for a $12 billion Pentagon contract called JEDI. And just recently, in fact, yesterday, when the news leaked that Google had bypassed its own privacy and security team while planning a censored search engine in China, an engineer at Google went on Twitter and said, it's our job as Googlers to have the backs of the people who look out for our users' privacy and security. We should be ready to strike if this product goes forward. I'm putting up $100,000 towards our strike fund. Who will match it? My fellow Googlers. And within about 3 hours, she'd matched that $100,000 strike fund. And it's still growing. I think it's at about $1 million now. And so there is this enormous labor shortage that gives this enormous labor leverage to people who want to look into this ethical dimension of what they're doing. The CEO of Google's cloud business was forced to resign after her bid to bring the company to military contracting failed. Now, there is a domain of machine learning in which there is no labor shortage. There's a huge labor surplus, which is snake oil. So there is an enormous oversupply of people who don't know how to do machine learning, but are willing to lie about how well they know machine learning. And if you're making a product where no one cares whether it works or not, then you can have a huge customer base for that kind of thing. And so these are the things Kathy Neal called weapons of mass destruction. An example would be something like an automated sentencing tool, or a tool that predicts where the police should go and ask people to empty their pockets in case they have drugs or knives. Those tools are notoriously inaccurate, but since their accuracy is never measured, there are a lot of engineers, or engineers in quotes, who are happy to work on those projects and continue to do the work. One thing that I wanted to say about dual-use technologies is that in a lot of network contexts, it's not so much that technologies are dual-use as they are Rubicons or thresholds. So if you have a network that has no choke point through which there is filtering or censoring or surveillance, that network has a huge institutional barrier that you have to overcome to institute it. Once you add a filtering mechanism or a censoring mechanism, whether that's to catch child pornography or some other category of speech, even malicious hacking attempts, once there's a place through which all the traffic goes and a tool that spies on the traffic, it becomes a kind of moral hazard. People come along and start to use that tool for other purposes. And we've seen this function creep with, especially with child filters in Scandinavia, Australia, UK, where what started out as filters that policed a very narrow category of content now police very, very broad categories of content.
There's a kind of mission creep that attaches. Yeah.
One of the issues that this last bit of discussion raises for me is if you do a history of how people get around attempts at censorship, you discover a rather creative species. People find ways around. It's astonishingly less difficult in the 17th century to get around censorship than people might imagine, and doubly so for the 18th century. Are some of you raising the possibility that the ease of getting around censorship is going to be severely limited by the impersonality of it, by the algorithmic nature of it.
Actually, in literature, that's the kind of area that creativity really comes in. And in fact, in the colonial Korea, many of the kind of political and social and other potentially dangerous contents were all really kind of suppressed. And journalists and intellectuals and teachers, they really go into literary medium because they could go around the censorship. So, for instance, one of the things that coming out from this censored literary tradition is that instead, when you have a very able-bodied male and very intellectual political activist role is supposed to be portrayed, you cannot use that person because the Japanese colonial censors will not allow. Then you change that into impaired and young and weakened bodies, often female or childlike. They are the ones who will take over some of the kind of political subversive energies. So you have to really go around and why these particular kind of patterns and configurations of the characters are actually employed in the literary work.
I mean, the human spirit is to an extent irrepressible. There's an extremely long tradition in the Chinese context going way back into imperial times of using historical allegory to talk about things that are impossible to talk about in a current context. But that automatically presumes that you're dealing with a highly literate, extremely educated audience who can interpret, read between the lines, and extract the meaning from that historical allegory. And so it consequently developed that one mark of one's erudition in China was to be able to master that kind of language. And you see that in Cultural Revolution texts where people are attacking each other in the most obtuse, impenetrable language, but it is a code that requires an extremely high level of training and learning to be able to decipher. But the people who were meant to understand what it was about were able to sort of extract the meaning. Today on social media in China, too, you have a similar sort of cat and mouse game between the censors and the algorithms and the humans behind the algorithms who are meant to catch whatever the algorithms miss, using allegory, using new vocabulary, using neologisms to talk about things that yesterday one could talk about but today can't. And so you talk about it in a quite different way. But what it also means is that it is impenetrable and very difficult to keep up with how this language is evolving. And so it instantly raises the threshold and limits the audience for it too. And so to an extent, the censors still win a little bit by making it so hard to talk. 5 or 10 years from now, people will look back on some of these materials and, I mean, they will be unreadable because they're written in such a sort of dense code that changes from week to week, month to month, and it takes a tremendous amount of effort to stay up to speed on that.
I wanted to mention a very good paper that came out this week from the Berkman Center at Harvard by the political scientist Henry Farrell and the cryptographer Bruce Schneier about the using information security to understand disinformation campaigns in democracies. And the question they seek to answer is, why is it that disinformation campaigns make autocracy stronger and democracies weaker? They use the example of Putin and his oligarchs deliberately sowing disinformation about what the political views are of different actors in the political sphere. For example, which political groups are secretly funded by the Kremlin on both sides of the debate, and so on, and how that has worked to strengthen Putin's hand. But when the same campaigns are worked in the US, it weakens the democracy, weakens the institution. And their conclusion is that in an autocracy, the system requires that people not have good public knowledge about the views of other people, that once you know how many other people with you that things are kind of messed up, you are likely to challenge authority structures. And in a democracy, legitimacy springs from the idea that you actually have a pretty good handle on how neighbors are thinking, so that when politicians reach a decision, even if it's not one that you can agree with, you can see how it arrives at some kind of compromise that splits the difference between what you can live with and what your neighbors can live with. And that when disinformation campaigns are worked in democracies, that fragments knowledge of what people actually believe, and it makes it hard for us to judge the justice of policies that we I wanted to also raise the question of, while celebrating how clever we can be at circumventing censorship and the joy that we can take from, in a kind of bloody-minded way, spreading the word about something that someone has censored, the Streisand effect, and making sure that people know the forbidden knowledge. I'm concerned that when we valorize this as the answer to censorship, or as a partial answer to censorship, that we are maybe committing the fallacy of survivor bias, right? If censorship works some of the time, then we wouldn't know it because the censorship worked. And so when we say, well, people are infinitely creative and they find their way around censorship, and all the dangerous ideas of Korea this period or France this period managed to survive despite the censorship, what we're really saying is all the ideas that weren't successfully censored. We don't necessarily have a look into the successful censorship view. And the last thing I wanted to say is about whether or not networks are better at censoring than humans. And at least in one respect, it's a kind of mathematical formulation, which is that steganography, hiding a message inside another message, like disguising a text inside a picture, flipping bits of the last digit of each pixel. It's actually pretty easy to defeat statistical methods, because the histogram of that image, statistical picture of how the pixels are arrayed in that image, different from what a normal picture would be. That information has its own characteristic signature, and when you add information to a file, it's actually pretty easy statistically to determine that that file has extra hidden information in it. And that's one thing that computerized censorship is really good at, particularly if you care if you over-censor, right? If you don't care if you block stuff that does not have steganographic hidden information, then you can pretty much limit steganography.
I'm interested in the mechanism of the new censorship and the technical proficiency that might or might not work to certain degrees. Someone goes from mainland China to Hong Kong briefly, picks up a paper and reads about the persecution of the Muslim Uyghurs in the southwest of China. Right? They're being sent to re-education camps, people are being housed in their homes. Now he goes back to China. And he said, I want to find out about this for himself. Can one get around it? What happens if one searches on the internet for knowledge of the Uyghurs and the persecution of Muslims in the Southwest?
Right. I mean, that gets to the question about whether censorship needs to be perfect to be censorship.
Doesn't, right? Clearly?
Yeah. I think a determined person clearly can get that information if they're so inclined, and if they're willing to undertake technical, use VPNs to hop the firewall easily. It can be done, but it's much harder today than it was even 5 years ago.
Well, that's effective censorship.
Yes, and one has to, of course, have the inclination. I think for censorship to be most effective also requires not just the sort of absence of information or barriers to the acquisition of information, but also sufficient information to distract, amuse, and satisfy people to keep them from looking for the things that they can't find. And so to the extent that someone certainly could find information on Xinjiang if they wanted to, but then the question is how many people want to, how many people want to go to the trouble of doing it, and then once they learn what they're able to learn about it, in what context can they actually act on that information, disseminate that information without encountering consequences from the state. And so in a way, the Chinese government has been highly effective by raising the barriers. They don't have to be perfect. It just has to be hard enough. And the consequences for disseminating what you do learn have to be hard enough that, in effect, you put a blanket on the circulation of that information.
One difference there from 17th and 18th century France, especially from 18th century France, is you had remarkable sympathy to the new philosophy, to the Enlightenment within the very structures that were controlling censorship. The director of the library in France, royal appointment, leading monarchist, lost his life defending Louis XVI during the French Revolution, a man named Malesherbes. He allowed so much circulation of Enlightenment thought, but he also was the head of a regime that had to honor less the church than the monarchy and the honor of people. He's much more willing to censor personal libels and satires against individuals than he is the circulation of the most subversive ideas in the course of the French Enlightenment. And this is true of the whole regime of censors in the 18th century on the whole. Significant numbers of them very sympathetic to the new ideas, and while they understand they have to do something to limit circulation, raising prices, they want to aid Enlightenment authors. There is, of course, no such equivalent in China or in Putin's Russia that they are able to serve. You get remarkably paradoxical situations. The censoring of Beaumarchais' Le Mariage de Figaro is a philosophe censor. He's a member of some of the most radical salons in Paris, a man by the name of Suard. For example, the head of the Librairie, Malesherbes, writes to one of the two editors of the Encyclopédie, the great French encyclopedia, when D'Alembert, great mathematician, philosophe, writes to him and says, there's a play that's just been performed in Paris, Les Philosophes. It slanders us. It insults us. And Malesherbes, the voice of royal authority, writes to him and says, well, I let you speak, I'm letting him speak. About 20 years later, so attuned to the Enlightenment are major players in the regime in France that the lieutenant of police for all of France, Sartine, writes to Diderot. And he says, oh, there's a terrible piece being written about you. Do you want it suppressed? Do you want him punished? And Diderot says, no, give him the same liberty that I have to write. So the remarkable phenomenon in a changing French and European context of growing sympathy within monarchical regimes to people who are willing to assert the legitimacy of the monarchy and criticize the church and secondary institutions of France does make getting around censorship remarkably easier.
To some extent, I think, to my mind, this brings us back to the question that I sort of wanted to start with. So if in the 18th century, censorship is a negotiation, and some things sure get suppressed, but usually it's not quite a question of suppression, it's a question of channeling. And things appear with different levels of permission, or they appear through different venues or something like that. And if in China now, it's often the case that it's not sort of technically impossible to find things out. It's a question of having the expertise and the will and the means to adopt sufficiently sophisticated VPNs or whatever it might be. Now we can't do anything about China particularly, but in modern UK or Western Europe or the United States, we face issues where information is channeled, and we face this kind of issue rather like, in a certain sense, the lost ark in the big warehouse, where our issue as citizens is often not that something has been out and out suppressed. It's that to find the truth, we're having to wade through massive amounts of sometimes deliberate disinformation. And the question, I think, for institutions, not least the university sector, is what do we do? How do we form the next generation of readers, citizens, such that they are not just sort of willing to live in this world, but are actually going to be informed, motivated, active discerners of meaning and truth in that environment, an environment that realistically isn't going to get that much better. Right? It's not that next year we'll be back into the, maybe whatever the period you think is good, the 1970s, where the New York Times finally is the arbiter of truth and we can just go to that. That's probably not going to happen. We're probably, we may take down whatever the Putin-esque agents were that screwed us up in 2016, but there's going to be replacements for them. And in that sense, the point of application where maybe we can do something about this is not so much the point of the creation of records, media, content, and so forth. It's the point of reception. In other words, it's you and me. So my question really to hit to the panel, but in some sense also to everybody else, is the Lenin question: what is to be done?
I've been thinking for 20 minutes about the question of manpower raised by Corey, and whether it's true that there's no shortage of second sons to go into the church in the Inquisition. And the answer, of course, is that the Inquisition is always strapped for manpower and desperately feeling that they don't have enough people to police what they're looking at. And I wonder whether thinking of that in comparison to digital censorship technologies, whether it's valuable to think about both, do you need these resources elsewhere, and how expensive was it to produce this resource? So an inquisitor is from a pretty good family, educated enough to have strong Latin. That's very expensive. That's a very expensive investment on the part of the family that produced this. And then in a patronage network dominated pre-modern Europe, that is a person who has the potential to be an enormous political asset for the family and allies of that family that person comes from. This is a political tool who can exercise influence in offices that have political. This is an economic tool who can get positions where they're going to have a high salary, which bring benefices in. They can block memories of rival families or rival patronage networks from offices. So the decision to use that human labor unit for censorship, to use the man hours of such an expensively produced person, produced in a period in which a library is itself extremely expensive. And if we think of the expensive resources of a modern university are investing in a particle accelerator, they're spending to have a Latin library what we're spending on a particle accelerator. So they're spending on producing this Latin reading second son what we're spending on producing a nuclear reactor. They really are. It is an enormously valuable bit of manpower and economic investment that you then have to decide, are we going to use this to censor things? Or are we going to use this for something else, to advance my political regime, to defend my family, to battle the English, whatever it is that you can deploy that resource on? And I wonder whether we want to compare the investment that went into producing an educated inquisitor more to the investment that goes into a mega processing power supercomputer today than the production of an individual censor today who, and I'd love to hear a comment on this from the Korea colonial standpoint as well, you don't need as sophisticated an education, I think, to be a censor now as you needed to be a censor then, when a lot of the material is moving in a literary language, when all this coded material is being used. And there's a huge difference in what's possible when a censor has to be an incredibly esoterically trained person, an expensively trained person, from when it can be a comparatively lay produced person. Now the programmer who makes the algorithm probably needs a more expensive and comparable training, or the hardware designer who makes the machine. But the interesting question of manpower, I think, is one that's changed a lot in different contexts of censorship.
I think I would like to just respond to that because I want to compare, say, post-colonial South Korean censors during the dictatorial authoritarian military regime versus Japanese colonial censors in the 1920s and 30s. So when I compare the content and the ways in which the sophistication is kind of like differently played out in these two cases, I can see that Japan really invested on the formation of the censor. So I think 2 points. One, they had to really rely on creating Korean colonial censors who are really versed in both Japanese language equivalent of Latin and also Korean vernacular language. and also very much versed in cosmopolitan kind of liberal thoughts that were kind of circulated in Europe and Japan, so that they could really go into this constantly kind of outsmarting creators. Before that, the Japanese censors had to be really kind of controlled through actual numbers, because on the permission system, they didn't have to permit many newspapers to be published in the first place. So just stick to 2. That was two Korean newspapers are allowed. And the reason is that there was only one censor who is so competent and has all the knowledge, and he would be forming the kind of like head of the mind of the whole publication police. And so because there are not many people who had that kind of trained knowledge, they did not permit more newspapers to be published. And through that process, what is very interesting about this colonial case is that colonial Korean censors that are employed later, after only the Japan period is over, they are the ones of the public educational system, the product of the public educational system, not the private educational system. So public was more or less controlled by the colonial regime, whereas the private was more or less like subject to various kind of variances. So only the graduates of Geisho Imperial University or like some legal kind of vocational school graduates were employed. And they're the ones, interestingly, were not been to abroad. Whereas all the writers were, in fact, went to Japan or Shanghai or United States. But these censors really keep the mind of the Japanese colonial state, and then kind of infiltrating the whole kind of public educational system.
Neat.
You know, I think you put your finger on a very important point. You can tell me if you think that this is the right metaphor, but one way I understand the way censorship in the manpower question of censorship has changed in the last several centuries is the sort of progression from a kind of artisanal model of production to a rational bureaucratic industrial form of production in the early 20th century, where you had Leninist bureaucracies or highly bureaucratic states which created structures of control that were organized along very modern lines of sort of Weberian rationality, to now a model that is beyond the industrial age and possibly post-industrial, and now the machine, or the computer age, the digital age. And it's a different kind of metaphor, which with, just as, you know, the progression from artisanal production to industrial production lowered costs and was a force multiplier for each input of human labor. Similarly, the algorithms are force multipliers for the inputs of human labor, and they allow people lower on the production scale with a kind of differentiation of labor input to play different roles and to be much more efficient at lower cost. And so I think that kind of model helps you understand how it has changed over the centuries. And so that allows, you know, in China, there's a term, the 50-cent army, which kind of encapsulates the idea that the costs of hiring people to participate, to kind of mold social discourse, to chime in, to you know, kind of bury dissenting views with the party line on social media, and also to kind of pull the plug on dissenting views and censor them. It is so cheap now because the technology has changed and people are willing to play that role who don't require the kind of investment that it once did require.
Now, Adrian, I realize I totally undercut your beautiful question about what we can do. So I hope we can talk about that tomorrow, but Corey won't be with us tomorrow. So I wonder, Corey, whether you'd like to address Adrian's question now before we have to sign off today.
I think that we have historically worried about selective enforcement and the discrimination that comes with it, where, you know, the cop who pulls over a black kid for speeding charges him with a felony, and then pulls over the mayor's white son for speeding and says, boys will be boys. And clearly there's a problem with that. But the corollary of that problem, maybe the inverse of that problem in the machine age, is perfect enforcement with no common sense. And we had a presage of this, for example, with the zero tolerance policies around school violence and weapons over the last decade, where you have high schoolers who, there was one person I wrote up who bought a used backpack, not realizing that there was a pocket knife forgotten in the lining of the backpack, a little couple-inch pocket knife, who was excluded from school and faced criminal charges for bringing a weapon onto school property. And that's the kind of thing where common sense should intervene, but in the absence of a space for common sense, just get these paradoxical or nonsensical outcomes. And the machine version is full of a lot more of those. I mean, we do also get discriminatory outcomes where the people who design the algorithms, train the data, or whatever, have preferential access to their contours and can make sure that use cases that they agree about get tested for and fixed, whereas use cases that might hurt someone else never get a look in. But much more significant, it is the perfect enforcement. It's the idea that there's just never a time when anyone gets to say the word fuck, for example. And one of the ways that this really manifests is that school censorware, information about how to report sexual assault, what constitutes sexual assault, often includes frank anatomical terms and therefore falls afoul of the filter, whereas the harassment be imaginative and use synonyms that the filter never finds. And so now you have a situation where the harassers get to carry on with impunity, and the information you need to stop the harassment is blocked by the filter that was meant to prevent harassment in the first place.
I think we must draw to a close because it's 4:20, so the common sense thing to do would be to adjourn until tomorrow morning. So thank you, panelists. Thank you, Corey.
Thank you, Corey.